Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the first edition of Level Up Hour here in 2021. I am Chris Short, host and executive producer of OpenShift TV, wishing you a very happy new year. I am joined by two wonderful Red Hatters today, the illustrious Langdon White and the always brilliant Scott McCarty. Langdon, you want to talk about what we're talking about today?
Yeah. As we said, I'm Langdon White. We're doing the Level Up Hour, which is a show about kind of, you know, giving you some experience with containerization from a kind of non-developer perspective. We also cover some development stuff as well. But, kind of if you haven't really played around with containers, what we want to talk about here is why they're interesting and why they might be useful to you in your everyday, potentially administrative life, as well as a developer's life. And then by extension, why you might want to deal with orchestration, right? And where orchestration comes in handy. Today, in particular, we are talking about some news that hit kind of just before, the holidays, that has everyone stressed out, which is the idea that the that Docker is being deprecated in Kubernetes, which is not entirely an accurate statement, and we kind of want to show why it's not entirely accurate, as well as like why it's something that you should be able to deal with in the vast majority of cases by just kind of ignoring. um, so that's why we're here today, and we brought Scott, and I'll let him introduce himself, but mostly because he has the deep dive scary internals of containers expertise, particularly on RHEL, that we think will be useful to this discussion. It's useful to a lot of discussions, but normally it's hard to, deal with the energy that Scott has all the time. So we have to take him in small doses. But he hasn't had his proper allotment of coffee, so we'll see how he is today. Go ahead, Scott.
Hey, how's it going, Langdon? I guess I'll introduce myself. My name is Scott McCarty. I am a product manager for container tooling and images. And so I drive the roadmap for like Red Hat Universal Base Image and Podman and Scopio and Builda and Cryo inside of OpenShift. And then I'll say this, like, so we went through this whole Kubernetes thing where everybody kind of got nervous. We went through this like 2 years ago. So like Red Hat in particular moved away from Docker, to Cryo and Podman with the launch of RHEL 8 and with the launch of OpenShift 4. And so I published probably 5 articles about that around that time and allayed a lot of people's concerns at that point. And so, yeah, I have a lot of it. It's funny. We already have the experience that the rest of the world is now starting to go through it. I'm like, oh, welcome to my world. For the last
Yeah, Scott is the I don't know, container runtime genius of Red Hat, right? Like if you
I think Dan Walsh
recall,
is the genius. I'm just the
well, you're yeah,
clown.
true. That there's that. But
The reporter,
um
perhaps.
so yeah, like if you remember a few months ago now, we had Scott on talking about all these different like run C, C run, kata containers and how to like they all just kind of work. It's just files on a file system that you tweak and off you go kind of deal.
Well, that's
This
kind of
is
like
kind
that's
of the
kind of what I
same
was.
thing, right? Like, yeah.
I mean, this is the idea behind OCI, right? Is like there was an organization that developed a spec
Yep.
so that we wouldn't, have to worry about this kind of problem, right? Is that we can have kind of competitive container runtimes that will all run the same kinds of things, and in a lot of ways, it seems like it has been very successful, and so that's kind of a little bit what we want to talk about. Um, should we hit the slides or dive right in? I don't know. We need everyone to wake up a little bit and start asking some questions. So I was wondering if we should show our slides.
Yeah, I mean, this is the level up hour. You kind of have a program, so let's do that.
Yeah, exactly. Now I have to find the slides, which is
Oh, you lost them, of
always a
course. Yeah.
always a challenge. And of course, because it's been a few since we last had the show, nothing is going to be logged in, and I changed providers and all that jazz. Let's see. How about present? Oh, right. But we have the fun. You can't present in the same in a different window anymore. It's really annoying. Um, All right. Let's see.
No, the changes that have happened to our normal tooling over the break
The
is
break.
interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I finally figured it out though. Let's try
We need
this
theme
button.
music. There we go.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
there we go.
More Jeopardy music. Although, actually, and Alex Trebek's last episode was in the past couple weeks as well,
Yeah, that's true.
which was very sad.
Much
All right,
love.
so as we said before, this is the Level Up Hour. In case you were lost, and theoretically, I'm sharing my screen, although all my windows are now rearranged and confusing. So just about the show, we are your regular hosts. I'm Langdon, and Chris is Chris Short, both on Twitter. That's kind of our primary kind of communication for push mechanisms. And then if you want to have a chat about this show or basically about anything else, OpenShift TV, or really anything in general, you can join us on our Discord. And in fact, you can use the Discord to participate in the chat for this show and all the other shows, because it's all thanks to restreamed around to all the different ways that this channel is broadcast. So let's see. Just by way of background, as we mentioned, this is Kubernetes and Docker Deprecation. I'm thinking about changing the episode titling because I'm still struggling with like what does season mean, right? In a live streaming thing. So instead, I went with the super clear and understandable year, month, day format because then at least it will order automatically by with
like
LS.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm toying with that. And actually, these are just the show notes from last time. I forgot to update that piece of text, but the link is correct to the last episode's show notes. So check those out if you like. And we try to recap the whole show and talk about kind of what I try to do is I try to capture everything that happened as well as like capture like, hey, you want to learn more about this particular subject, go check out the further reading on this. I try to pull out some fun video highlights. I'm more successful than others depending on how funny we were that particular episode. So remember, more funny is better. That way I can find video clips. But that's it for the slides for the moment, because otherwise, we would be giving away the sweet internet points, and we want to hold that till later.
Yes.
So, do we have any questions so far? Is anybody? We have a few people, it looks like.
Yes, we have a lot of people in chat, but Narindev is asking when is the Get Ups happy hour? Is next week, correct? At 3 p.m. Eastern on Thursday.
Nice.
So we were thinking about changing the time. I'm not sure if we're going to do that. That'll be discussed later today.
Exactly. Cool.
Yes,
so
stay tuned to the calendar, which I'll drop a link to in the chat right now.
Well, thank you to everybody who is, a regular on the show and has come back today. We appreciate it. So how do we want to kind of talk about this? Scott, should I look to you and kind of say, can you give us a little bit more detail on what this change means? I know there's a bunch of good blog posts, good articles out there, but I think it's always useful to kind of explain it in voice and see, and help, maybe that'll engender some questions about, some of the details that maybe people are confused about.
Yeah, I was thinking I could probably walk through the 5 main points I made about like what the 5 pieces, what does Kubernetes support even mean? And I kind of break it down into 5 things, and we could probably like walk through each one. Even though I wrote them in text, you know how it is verbally. Like once you start talking about something, you highlight things, anecdotes and things that you hadn't thought about and things you didn't capture.
Sounds great.
Probably be useful.
Yeah. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what does it mean?
Yeah, and I'll share. If I share a link, I guess what's the best way to share a link with everyone? Like, is
in the chat is actually the best. If you want to send it to me, I can push it to the chat or
the Zoom chat?
Share it however you want, Scott.
Yeah, we'll make sure it lands in the right place. How's that?
Okay. Cool. I have shared it on the Zoom chat because I know we end up restreaming over other things, so I never know how this. You guys have the most sophisticated setup out of anyone I know.
It's all about magic. It's all about the
Magic.
magic.
All the magic. Yeah.
It is technology used sufficiently such that it appears to be magic.
Right. Right.
So like I wrote obviously an article on this, and then I was a little clickbaity, I'll fully admit, with like Kubernetes is removing Docker support. Kubernetes is not removing Docker support. Like
We didn't do that with this show at all, you know,
No.
with
Yeah, I
the
would never
title
do
or
that.
anything. Yeah, no, of
I would
course
never
not.
cop to that in 2020, 21. But you know, like and it's funny because I talked about all this like 2 years ago when we moved OpenShift to Cryo, and I was prepared that there would be a ton of questions. I mean, if you go back, we had started working on this even in OpenShift 3.7. So really, it's more like 3 years ago. I don't know, 3.5, 4-ish years. I can't remember the dates. Like that's how long ago it was probably 2016, 17. And actually, I just even filled in a history of all this. So we were already thinking about like once we saw once obviously OCI is one piece of this, and then CRI in general, like having the container runtime interface that Kubernetes ended up building, right? Like so you know, I started thinking about how could we talk about this, and like how could we explain what the difference actually means to people in something that they care about, right? And so you know, this version that I published recently is basically the culmination of like 3.5 years of thinking about this. So I think it's a lot more crisp now. I can explain it, but you know, there's basically 5 different things. When you say the word Docker, you know, like what does Docker support? There's like 5 different buckets of things you think through. The first one being like container images, right? Like, I mean, Dan Walsh talks about this all the time, and I still fundamentally believe like paths already existed. You know, so we already had highly automated ways to deploy code. We had that, like, and for some reason that a lot of people can't get their brain around, we ended up going backwards, right? We went backwards to something that isn't quite as easy, but way more powerful. And I feel like I have to keep reminding people of this, even though we've been doing it for like 6 years. There's a reason why containers took off. The container image is probably the fundamental reason, right? And so container images are still supported. Like, doesn't matter what container engine you're using, doesn't matter whether you have Docker, and if you're using Kubernetes with Docker or using Container D or using Cryo, you know, like that's supported no matter what, right? So like that's number one. Actually, let me highlight them all. So container images is the first thing, you know. The second thing is the registry server. The third time is the runtime format, and by that I mean like what does my container look like when it's running in Linux or Windows. And then the fourth thing is command line interface, and that's where it starts getting a little hairy. And then the fifth one is application programming interface. And if I were to like star all of these, I'd say like even not using, you know, you're getting like 5 stars still in container image format, 5 stars with registry server, 5 stars with runtime format. You're getting like 4 stars with command line interface, and you're maybe getting like 0 stars for like API. Like that is truly probably the biggest change. You know, is around the API, like what APIs are available, and whether you should have even been using those APIs anyway in the first place. But that's kind of beside that. We can get into that deeper. And so that
I was going to kind of comment on some of that, right? So one of the examples of kind of like should you have been using those APIs, right, is like Jerome, who I can never pronounce his last name, but starts with a P. You know, has talked several different occasions about things that you can do that are really really cool, like can you doing Docker inside Docker, for example.
Actually,
You know, and Dan Walsh, I remember specifically doing something along the same lines, particularly with with systemd inside Docker, and then Docker running in that, and then virtual machines. Like these are all very cool things. Cool in production, usually not something you should put together. You know, so like there are specific use cases where some of these things are like important and necessary or whatever, but the vast majority of cases you probably are trying to build something a little crazy.
Yeah, I agree. And what happens is people, I don't know if we don't have to tackle them in order, but we could probably jump into APIs because it's the hairiest one. But people usually end up in that scenario not on purpose. They they have they were like running a Kubernetes cluster like Kubernetes 1.11 or something, right? And they were running it with like, you know, with Docker because that was all that there was, you know, or whatever at the time. And then one day they go, oh, we need to scan our images. And they go, you know, security team came and beat us up, said we got to scan these images, but we got to do it in production. And you're like, how do we do that? And you Google search, and then you're like, oh, there's this tool that will talk to the Docker daemon and we'll like scan the images, right? Like, and you find it. And then you go, oh, you know what else we got to do? We need to do we need to like snapshot the image because like we did this update and then Kubernetes broke and blah, blah, blah. And like you end up down some rat hole, right? Like where you're like, oh, we tried to do an update, it failed. So now we're using the snapshotting tool that talks to the Docker API to snapshot it before we do an update. And you're like, wait a minute, that's getting pretty wacky. Like you probably shouldn't do that. Like you should probably let Kubernetes handle that. But okay, I mean, deployments are probably a better way of doing that. But like that's, it was at the time, it was the Wild West and nobody really like, actually even deployments didn't even, or maybe deployments existed, but actually I don't think deployments even existed early on. So like those are the kinds of, they were like these time-based, temporal, it's always a race condition, right? Like you have a business problem or a technical problem and you're like, I got to solve this thing. And then you end up fixing it before it's fixed kind of the right way because you have the problem today, right? And so then what happens is, I've seen it, some of our customers, even with OpenShift 3, they end up in the scenario where they have 2, 3, 4, 5 tools inside the Kubernetes cluster, like running on the nodes, talking to the Docker daemon. And that's probably the hairiest place. Like that's the hairiest place where you're like, oh man, ripping out Docker does kind of suck in that scenario. But for everybody else, like they won't even notice it, right? Like it should be like transparent.
Well, and I was going to say, like, one of the things that you kind of need to remember about Docker. Well, so first of all, I have a little bit of a demo that we can walk through in a little bit, but like when you say Docker, usually people are referring to the thing that launched, I don't know, 7 years ago or something now. That thing and what Docker the company, which wasn't even called Docker the company at the time,
right.
Are actually quite different, right? And so the thing that is necessary to remember is that when Docker was originally developed, it wasn't really meant to be this thing that would run in an automated kind of environment and specialized world. In a sense, it wasn't even really trying to replace like PaaS or something like that per se, not in the automation side of it, etc. It was really a UX tool, or a user experience tool for developers or administrators who worked for this particular company, which now I can't even remember the name of. .cloud, that's it.
Cloud, yeah.
That they were using this in their production environment to basically host other people's software. And then it just kind of took off by storm because of how awesome that user experience was. But what it didn't do a great job of was disconnecting the kind of client side tooling of it, so what it like a developer uses or even an administrator uses, and the production runtime. And so what Kubernetes has been kind of fighting with is accessing that production aspect, right? Their production runtime part of it by way of the client UX runtime or whatever. And that's what dockershim does, right? Is basically that hook. And so it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with the components underneath, but rather that it's like how they're linked together and how you have to access them. And in a sense, that's actually why Docker has gone on to create Containerd, for example, and pull that out. So you don't have to access the APIs in a non-public way.
And I view it as it's an API battle, right? Like it was an API battle. Like Heroku probably came out with PaaS. Heroku is the first company I knew about that did PaaS, right? Like all my friends that were in startups were using Heroku back in like, I don't know, 2008 or something. I don't remember. It was a long time ago, like 2011, 2008, that kind of time frame. And you go, okay, so that API started to kind of win, right? Like there was like, oh, I could just type these few commands or maybe wire it into my Ruby code and have like this deployment. They'd have these deployment scripts in Ruby that would just go out to Heroku and deploy the script, deploy like an entire application, right? And so you're like, oh, and at the same time, you had config management also competing, right? So that's another API for like configuring things and deploying things. And like, there's just this like wild west of deployment APIs is what I'd say. And then, then again, something like Heroku and then even OpenShift like 2 was really highly automated. Like it was really good. It took like one command to deploy something. One could argue it was actually every bit as easier as Docker or easier. But what it was Visual Basic. Like it was great as long as what you were doing was Visual Basic was good at it. And then as soon as you had to like do something that Visual Basic wasn't good at, you were like, oh dear God, I've now got to write like this C module and plug it in. And like, I mean, it became very hairy, very fast, right? Like it was good until it wasn't. And that's what, in my view, that's what PaaS was. It was amazing if all you wanted to do was deploy Ruby. But as soon as somebody said, oh, we have this actor pattern model thing where the Ruby things have to go fire up other Ruby things. They're like, well, you can't do that with PaaS. Like, that's crazy. Or like anytime you'd end up in one of these edge cases, getting out of paths became really pain in the ass. Then Docker came out, like you said, as like a management tool, right? Right. It was just like hey, let's deploy things easy. And that API just like clearly won. Like it was amazing. Like you're like, okay, this is way easier than everything else. Then
well, I mean, combine Bash with the experience of containerization, right? And I mean, basically, all a Docker file is, right, is a Bash script written in a way that something.
It was
else
kind of like Debs versus RPMs, to be honest. Like the Debs are just easier. Let's be honest. Like RPMs are harder. I mean, I know I'm a Red Hat guy, but that's a fair statement. Like it takes more work to get good at RPM and understand it. It is more powerful, but it also requires more investment. And the bottom line is people don't care about investment. They're like, I don't want to invest. I just want this to work, right? Like,
right.
So
get the job done.
Like,
yeah,
building Heroku, plugs or whatever, slugs or whatever they were called at the time, or building OpenShift 2 slugs. They were freaking hard. Like that was I got rebuffed by that like 10 times. Like I'd sit down and go to do it. I'd be like, I don't know. I don't feel like doing this. Like it was just hard.
Right. I did want to make a little shout out there with the Visual Basic comment though, because back when I was doing Visual Basic, we would actually literally have strings of assembly in our code that we would execute in RAM to rewrite vtables so that we could get what we wanted to work.
Oh,
so you could do anything.
You could do it.
So you try hard enough.
Yeah.
It was.
And then I'd say like the other problem is then the API battle went to, okay, Docker's really good at running a few services on a single node. And then we all saw that, wait a minute, at scale, you need like I don't know what cloud had internally, but I assume they're like, oh, this makes a single node really easy, but they probably had some extra software layer that went out and talked to the Docker API. And scheduling, like if you're a hosting provider, it's not the same as a cloud provider. Let's be honest. Like the spin up shutdown is like 5% of your workload and the running is like 95%. A cloud provider, like 35-40% is your spin up shutdown, right? Like your actual runtime capacity is probably lower. And that's the problem with configuring the networking, configuring the workload, allocating CPUs, deallocating, blah, blah. It's the allocation, deallocation that ends up eating so bad. And so like Kubernetes was way better at that, right? Like, and so as soon as you went to do that at scale, you're like, oh, but of course, Docker didn't want to give up, and Docker was the thing that Kubernetes got built on. So that talking to Docker was hard coded, and then we went through that period where we're like, oh, let's break this out. Let's call it the dockershim. That code was already part of Kubernetes. They basically just severed it, created an API called CRI in between, and then said, we'll keep that code, the same code that we've had forever, because it's really simple. It just runs a few Docker commands essentially. And then here we are, like whatever this is now, 5 years later or whatever the hell.
Well, I mean, also at the time, right? I mean, at the time, the standards weren't set either, right?
No,
right.
There
wasn't
CRI
maybe the first earliest draft of CNI was happening, or
R.
Yeah, no, CNI, right?
CRI is runtime.
CRI.
Right. So that or the container image format, which
I could rant about the name as well.
Yeah, right.
There's that.
Yeah, there's too many C's and N's in all of them, and I get them mixed up all the time. I need like a cheat sheet, along with my VI cheat sheet. So yeah, but so I mean, it's like every other kind of nascent technology that we see, right? It goes through a lot of churn on kind of how it works and how it connects together, because particularly in the open source world, what wins is what works, and the person that wins is the one who writes the code, right? So you see, like, and then and even I really this is where I give Google a lot of credit, right? Where they really did push that kind of release early and often, and it's beta. Gmail was in beta for what, like 10 years or something. Like there's both a downside to that, in that you now have lowered expectations of end users about the quality of your software, but there is an advantage of there is that you can innovate. You can keep playing with it, you can keep working with it, and I think what you're just seeing here is that evolution of those.
But some people get pincered, and that's
right.
The people that had stuff that was talking to both the Docker API and the Kubernetes API in a big cluster do get pincered. But that is a minority, right? Like that should be a very small minority. It hit vendors, like ride along vendors. Like, there were vendors that would go and talk to the Docker API to scan images. There were vendors that would talk to the Docker API to do backups of data. Like there was all kinds of experimentation. And the problem is experimentation in a marketplace once I've bought it, I'm annoyed, right? Like I'm going to be very annoyed if I have money and time, labor and capital invested in this, and now the carpet gets moved. And that's probably the biggest downside of the Docker deprecation is like the people that have that. But the good news is, and this is why I don't mention this in the article, like the good news is Red Hat already blazed this trail for you. So we went through a lot of this pain banging our head against those metal objects, ahead of time, so that most, because OpenShift is probably the biggest, Kubernetes distribution that is independent, that people install themselves, right? It already blazed a trail here in that, like, all the vendors that work with Kubernetes were like, I want to work with OpenShift. And when we moved to Cryo, they went, oh, we got to use the CRI interface. We can't just go directly to the Docker daemon. And so at a minimum, there's hundreds of vendors that were either looking at, they're at some stage of the pipeline of either looking at moving to CRI, in process of moving to CRI, or have moved to CRI. And so like Datadog and Anchor and Black Duck and I talked to probably like 100 vendors, in the last 2 years of like, how are they going to move from the Docker API to CRI basically? And so the good news is that trail is getting blazed already and is mostly blazed. So like by the time it hits you will be another year from now, say, because it's deprecated, it's not gone. But
although I will, I mean, like I said, I think largely we're trying to kind of say, we really hope for the vast majority of use cases, this is not that big a deal. I was a little surprised to discover that the removal is actually sooner than I thought. It's actually the end of now this year.
Yeah. Oh, is it? Yeah, that is.
Yeah,
earlier
so
than I thought too.
yeah, I thought it was going to be more like a 2-year thing, but going back to that kind of innovation thing, two aspects of that, right? One is that it does churn a lot, so things do move fast. But on the flip side of that, one of the things we have learned over the years with highly innovative things, whatever, is to actually have, for lack of a better term, LTS-ish, versions, right? So there are versions of Kubernetes that are sticking around longer, right? I think, we have an OpenShift out, for example, that's got a longer term of service than traditional, right? So you can probably delay that adoption without losing too much. One of the things that was the big driver for something like RHEL for adoption, right, is that the hardware was changing. So you couldn't delay it. If you went and bought new boxes, right, and they had new, whatever, SATA drivers or something, you had to go get the new RHEL. Like you didn't have any choice, because the straight up hardware is different. With something like Kubernetes or whatever, like the delay is less, or like it's less forced to kind of move on. Obviously you want to maintain support, whoever's your vendor is providing support, but aside from that, there's not a big driver to move aside from being able to take advantage of features. And features are often a good driver to remove, but at the same time, it's not because it won't work otherwise, right? So I think that's
the secret of cheap hardware is that it changes fast.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Intel and ARM are always going to have the fact that they move fast, and so you get dragged along. Back in the day, you paid a lot for Unix hardware, and then it didn't change very often, and you could run it for 20 years if you wanted.
So I did want to pause.
Dirty secret of cheap hardware.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, what drives me crazy, right, is you buy a laptop, you buy the exact same vendor version or whatever, and you'll get two different ones and they'll have different hardware in them. One that has Linux support and one that doesn't, for example. Yeah. All right. So one quick pause here. I've been skimming the chat, but Chris, are there any questions in the chat we should answer?
There was questions about when exactly the pulling of the dockershim was going to happen. I'm looking up the version number now.
I pulled it out. It's 1.22 in late 2021.
Makes sense.
So I pulled it out. Like I said, with the show notes, I'll put my references in the further reading or whatever. So because I'm not sure which article I got that from, but I did pull that note out to myself so that I would have that handy.
And this is probably a good time to then dig into some of the other ones. Like for example, like this. Before you get worried about the date, think about whether you actually need it or not, whether you'll actually notice it or not. Like, if all you're worried about is container images, like we have a bunch of Docker images, they're saved in a registry, will we be able to use those? Does that have to change? No. Like, that doesn't have to change at all. That's easy, right? Like Cryo, Containerd, any other runtime, engine. This is probably a decent time to rant about the words matter. and we decided to name the interface in Kubernetes container runtime interface, even though run C, the thing that gets called by Docker, is actually the runtime, and Docker is basically a container engine. And so is Podman, so is Cryo, so is Containerd, but we still call it runtime, and so people are confused all the time. But the runtime is the same between all of these. So like when you fire up a container with Containerd, Cryo, Podman, Docker, doesn't matter, Builda, a bunch of other things. It's the exact same container in Linux. Like I used to do this demo where I would have Podman, and actually I think I had Cryo and Podman and Docker side by side, and I'd fire up 3 different containers. I'd use CRI-CTL to talk directly to Cryo, and I would fire up a container locally, and I would be like, hey, like now tell me which one was started by what daemon, like look at them. And they'd be like, oh, look at the SE Linux. I'm like, the SE Linux is the same. Like the svert code that we wrote, that's basically svert. It's called svert, a technology that basically dynamically generates a or a SE Linux label. That's the same in KVM. It's the same in Podman. It's the same in Docker. It's the same in everything because Run C uses it. So like Run C calls the same thing. And so like you literally can't tell these containers apart when they're running.
We could have named our database SQL, right, and our web server Internet Information Server. If we wanted to, play with the big boys. So yeah, actually, so I do have a little demo of that. Do we want to talk about that? Because I thought it was interesting, particularly seeing as I don't do multi-machine Vagrant files very often, and I always like to show off Vagrant as well. So I'll just share this dealio. All right, you should see VS Code. Is that what y'all are seeing? Okay, cool. Okay. So what I did was, obviously, I have a lot of experience with Podman, so that is first in my list here. But so we have, basically I just, I set up libvirt so that it has 4 CPUs and some RAM and whatever. But basically I just install Podman, Scopio, and Builda. I probably actually only needed Podman for this demo, but it's kind of my default install. And so I also love Vagrant. I just
hard to believe it's 10 years old.
Is it only 10 years old? I actually think it's
10
been
or
around
12, something like that.
Yeah.
I thought it was older too.
Yeah, and like I love the origin story of like basically making it, because I had this problem all the time because I was a web developer for a long time, is that like how do I make it on a Mac so that I can have multiple running web servers without having to know the ins and outs of virtualization and and like routing and all that other stuff, and it just works, and it's really, really good.
I still have a theory that Vagrant could have prevented Docker from ever existing if they would have had a image repository that was similar to Docker Hub.
Well, so I don't.
Everything.
If you remember, our original container development kit, which I had a big hand in, was based on Vagrant, and it did so. Vagrant relatively early on actually adopted Docker as a runtime. So the way Vagrant works is it basically wraps up a virtual machine and makes it kind of easier to manipulate, right? But it can also wrap up that virtual machine in, say, AWS or in wherever. But it can also wrap up a Docker container. And I'm not sure how much that's used anymore. But the way the original container development kit that we shipped worked was it would go get a RHEL box and then put containers on it and then let you manipulate those containers via Vagrant. I was pretty proud of it, as well as automatic registration, which I think was my most proud moment.
I remember using this too, but my brain is fuzzy on what year that was.
Yeah, I'm with you.
That tells you it was probably before 2010.
yeah, because maybe we're old. No, the CDK wasn't that long ago. It was only like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
All right, so the next thing I did was, okay, so if you've ever been on the show before or you've used RHEL, used Podman at all, this is really straightforward, right? And this statement, unlike in Docker, is highly unnecessary. I'm just doing it to make my VM a little bit smaller, a little bit cleaner. No particular requirement there. The next one I did was I went and actually looked at the like Docker install docs. And so I went to Docker's website. Now here is where the confusion really starts to begin. There are at least 3 different versions of Docker, which is the one I'm talking about here, which is the freely available and, I think fully open source, so I don't mean freely like as in not open source, but freely available engine that will run a Docker container. And if you notice, when I install it, I actually install I install containerd and Docker. And so as far as I can tell, what it's doing is that UX that we know and love is actually talking to containerd, which from earlier in this discussion, that what Kubernetes is talking about doing is exactly this. So basically it's kind of already working the way Kubernetes is planning to work, or, is kind of in the midst of moving towards, right?
Yeah, for the most part, I don't think the the Docker daemon doesn't use CRI to talk to containerd. I don't think, but
that's kind of where I wonder where that API kind of connection is.
I think it's an internal API. Yeah.
Okay. So long story short, so when we say Docker, we could mean this one, but there is also their enterprise version, which is what they, sell support on, which I didn't have a copy of handy. So I assume it's the same as this or very, very similar. So, your mileage may vary. It might be worth a follow-up just to test it out. But I imagine anything that works in the kind of freely available version will work in the fully supported version. So the part that gets confusing is that we have one more version of Docker, which is there was a name change of the upstream project to something called Moby. And this is not the New York City rapper, or not rapper, techno artist, who has a shaved head and looks weirdly like Jean-Luc Picard. But
I've never thought of it like that, but yes.
Right? So basically what I wanted to do here is, this is not an official installation, but it's pretty close. It was on Fedora Magazine, which is, published widely. If it was horribly wrong, it would have had, a wall of comments and would have gotten corrected. But this is how you get Moby on Fedora. And this particular article was written for 32, so I adapted it a little bit for 33. One of the big things to note is that it uses, what are we on, V2 of cgroups now, and this uses V1 of cgroups, which is fine, but it really will need to upgrade soon if it hasn't already. I didn't find any documentation that it had.
And the blocker has been historically run C. Run C won't, it wasn't quite ready. I don't know where that's at. Like as of today, it's close. I know that much because Giuseppe Scrivano, one of our guys, has been working on that a lot to get Run C to work with cgroups V2.
Actually, cool. It looks like somebody in the comments did say it does work with cgroup V2. I wasn't clear if it did or not, so that's why. Okay, it looks like it doesn't work in Fedora.
I thought he was really close upstream, or yes, it sounds like he got it done. Yeah, I wasn't tracking it super close.
So this line here should become unnecessary soonish, right? But it kind of installs the way you normally do. I was a little confused about why it installed Docker Compose by default, but probably because Docker Compose is super useful. And we've covered that in another episode as well. Trying to replicate some of the Docker Compose experience with Podman.
And this is a time where I'm going to do shameless plug for Podman. In Podman 3.0, we'll be able to support Docker Compose.
Really?
Yeah.
Sweet.
You'll be able to use the Docker Compose binary. It will talk to Podman, and it will literally deploy containers.
Because I've been doing it with YAML, and I'm all set to switch to Signal. So yeah, doing it in YAML, while what I kind of make the point of it's forward compatible if you want to move to something like Kubernetes, which is super nice, rather than Docker Compose, which is kind of like a dead end. But Docker Compose has a great user experience, much like Docker itself. That's really hard to pass
And there's a
up.
bunch of code written in it. So like one of the migration paths we're hoping to support is you can use the Docker Compose, get some of your Compose files basically running in Podman, and then do the kube generate, generate kube, and then generate the Kubernetes YAML. And so then like we see a path there where you'll be able to basically import your Compose files, get it running, make sure it's exactly how you want, and then save it off as like a Kubernetes YAML. And then you're in Kubernetes YAML world, and it feels like you're free because you can go between Podman and Kubernetes all you want.
There's a question in chat. When is Podman 3 going to be available?
Tomorrow.
May-ish.
May-ish.
Early May. I mean, actually,
So-
you'll probably end up being able to test it on Fedora and send to a stream probably January, probably later this month, I would guess. Like
Wow.
maybe early February.
As somebody else brings up in the chat, yes, the only dates we can provide ever are date-ish. Yes, but yes, which is a very weird form of speed dating that you don't want to participate in. So yeah, kind of going back to the code here of code, basically the install script. So I think I shared the whole screen, so you should be able to see this. But what I wanted to kind of make the point of is like, and I will cheat with the, hey, I did this in advance so that it would actually work. But I promise I didn't make any changes besides what is checked into the repo. It is actually, if you want to look at the repo, it's there under the branch called 2021-01. 06. It's just I don't like to actually push it to master until I have the show notes and everything in there. But it is pushed. So if you want to see this Vagrant file or the Docker file I'm about to show you, it is there. The only thing that maybe I'll go one of these days and write a patch for Vagrant.
What does TLUH mean?
Come on.
Level up hour.
The level up.
Oh, all right. I was like, Tla?
Is this some new tool that I don't know about?
Exactly.
That's really hard to say in my mind.
Yes. So I would really like Vagrant SSH to, instead of just yelling at you for not choosing which server you want, why can't it just prompt you for which server you want? I don't understand why I have to type it in again. Because I'm lazy. So theoretically that's running and that's cool. So what we can do here is, I kind of like, oh boy. Like I said, I did a little bit of this in advance, but I just made a super simple Docker file where, I get Fedora and then I install, a couple things, and then I do my clean just to make it a smaller container image, and I give it a command. This is worthwhile to explore more complex Docker files, and I just wasn't sure the value versus time kind of trade-off for it. So feel free to play around with this yourself. That's part of why I published the Vagrant file. Feel free to go grab it and use it any way you like. But so one thing I'll point out, we have to do it with sudo. One of the tricks on at least most of the Linuxes, I don't know about doing it much on Windows or Mac, because I mostly use Linux. One of the tricks is actually to add your user to the Docker group, which will let you do it without sudo, but be aware that you are running it as root. You just happen to have, basically it's a no password sudo kind of scenario. So you can just run the command rather than having to actually choose it. So we just do Docker build, and I will create a new build just to show you it working. And hey, caching is a lovely thing. So it was already built. So it basically just runs and installs. And then we can say Docker run IT. And this actually, yeah, IT. I don't want to remove it. So I want to make sure that this is going to stick around to finish the demo. And that should just work. And it does, look at that. So now I can ping. And one of the cautions that I read in one of the articles was that The networking may be slightly different, so that is some place where your mileage may vary. And let me see if I can find my note.
What about the networking, Langdon?
Yeah, so I was just looking for it.
I can smell smoke.
I know. I'm trying to read where did I get that from? I may be crazy.
That's entirely possible.
It is possible, but I thought I saw somewhere so that's what it was. Private networking within a Docker within containers may be slightly different, so it's worth experimenting with, but it shouldn't be. Unless you're doing something kind of truly crazy.
And you actually bring up something I didn't bring up in the article. This is another place where you might run into sharp edges going from Docker to cryo or containerd.
Right.
Like the way networking is done. When you end up doing it with CNI, it could end up being slightly different. But this is another one of those ones that I do not understand how people end up down this rat hole. Like this is one that I'd never have understood. Like I've never changed the networking ever because you're running web apps. Like why do you ever need to even muck with it? But somehow from data and talking to a lot of people always go down the rabbit hole of, well, I got to change IP. I got to do this. I'm like, why do you have to do that? Like, why does that matter? But it matters to a lot of people. So like, I'll warn, that's another warning area.
Yeah. So, I'm often one of those problem children. So
why?
You know,
why do you change the IP?
I like pain. I like to hurt myself.
Yes. I've literally never changed the default networking in Docker ever in 6 years. I've never had a reason to. I've never been like, oh, you know what? I really wish this would DHCP on my regular network with my VMs. Like, no, I don't care. Let it NAT. I could care less. Like, I literally don't care. Like, let it NAT. Let it.
Yeah. I was trying to think about it and part of it was actually really funny when I was going to set up this demo. This is the first time in a long time that I went to go put together a demo that was in VMs versus inside a container. But as you say that, I don't know that I've mucked with the networking like you're talking about, like kind of rejiggering how the DHCP works or any of that stuff. I mean, I've definitely done private networks and stuff.
Like, a lot of people, like if you look, the number one question we get in Podman is, hey, I'm doing this weird networking thing in Docker, and Podman's not a drop-in replacement. And they like get all mad, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're doing with your networking. Like, it's impossible for me to understand that.
That's hilarious. All right, so Coolio. I like to use the cool kid terms from 20 years ago as much as possible. On the show.
30 now, by the way.
Yeah, at least
30 years ago.
Yeah. So, all right. So we just created this new container. So, I don't think this gets enough play, but I still think that this feature is one of the coolest ones that there is. I'm actually not going to name it that. I'm going to make it something that I will remember. And so what we do is I'm just committing it. So basically what I said was, take this container, shove it in this tarball so that I can now transport it in the ugliest possible way I can, not using a registry, any of that stuff, just moving the tarball around. Because I thought that would be like the truest test in a sense. Like I know nothing has changed that container image because I've literally just tarred it off, right? So now we are going to, and one of the nice things about using Vagrant for this stuff is just you can do something like this, and you always know where your home is. That's weird. This totally worked. Now I can't type. I don't know what happens to me.
This is the place just for typos and demos not working. So
yeah.
So tell us what you're doing here, Langdon. Are you copying this over to?
I was going to take it from the Moby one, which is where I created it, to the Docker one. If I can type, which we know I have massive fail.
Copy pasta is your friend.
Exactly. All right, and so now we have that tarball. And obviously I was, well, that doesn't look good. 72 K, huh? Or
That
72
seems
bytes.
small.
Bytes.
Yeah, that seems
that's
that seems really
like
small.
that's the minimum tarball size you can have, I think.
Is it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just like the metadata for tar.
Yeah.
Did I do something wrong on my commit? Oops, I
Um,
lost my command, of course. No, that looks right, doesn't it?
That looks right to me.
Oh, no, it's not commit. Duh.
Export. I always get export and commit confused as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, that looks a lot more realistic.
And when you're piping it into tar, you basically got an error output or something.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Which, thanks, Tar. All right, so now we're going to jump to the Docker machine. And so, as you saw in the Vagrant file, this is just set up with the Docker CE per, Docker's installation instructions. And we are going to try our SCP, which is probably going to take a little bit longer. Yep, that looks better. And then now we conveniently can still just run Docker import, and then bloop. And then now the only difference is we may not have the name. Oh, which actually I can fix that because there's a command I discovered after the fact. I think this must have been added in like recent years because I swear you couldn't do this before.
Name it on the way in.
Yeah. Docker images, and there it is. And so now we can. It's funny.
It's probably important to point out that that was a copy of the running container that is now an image.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So it might have been more interesting if I'd modified it to show the change. But we can now run IT and just type Fedora. And I did something wrong.
Bash.
Yeah, it should have gotten the command though, shouldn't it?
When you import.
Yeah, I wonder if it lost my
I think
CMD.
it might lose. I think if you would have saved the image and imported the
yeah, if I exported the image instead of the container,
I think it would have worked. Yeah,
probably would have worked. Yeah. I wonder if that's what I did in my test, because I swear that was working. But we can prove that networking still seems to work. Yay.
That was longer than 23 milliseconds. I just want to point out in real life.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was your screen lagging.
There seems to be a delay on the initial.
Look at that. That's way longer than 22.6 milliseconds. Like that's definitely a lie.
Yeah.
We'll have to take that up with the Fedora people. Scott, I think you should file a bug that the ping response time is a lie, and see how well that goes. All right, so networking works. It's kind of like I don't know what else to kind of show. The fact that it runs at all is basically, we're in pretty good shape. Yeah, thank you for the won't fix in the comments. And I get that a lot from my from basically all of my bugs. All right, and then kind of just for the last example, we just have Podman, and it's funny, my muscle memory has definitely shifted to Podman versus from.
Mine has too.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really amusing. So let's just cheat and copy and paste. Okay, and then we can say sudo podman import. And what I love is that it's exactly the same command with whatever 6 different letters, except I don't need to do sudo because I can do this as me now. And then I can run. And yeah, that's weird. I totally thought that would carry. And then, everything just works exactly the same way. It even fails in exactly the same way by not picking up the command across the different versions.
We should point out, that's true because it's probably because it's important that OCI or Docker /OCI metadata. and it probably is the same. It probably is missing.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, we could. Oh, wow, that was impressively wrong.
And by default, like something that people might not realize if they're not deep in this world, like when you did it the way you did it, because you went from Docker to everything else, those are actually Docker specific image formats. It's like 99.8% the same as OCI, but it is technically slightly different.
Right. Yes.
And Podman didn't even hiccup, just imported and worked.
Right. It even says imported from Tarball. I don't think I've seen that before. But yeah, I mean, you can kind of go and inspect it. I think you can kind of see, I wonder, it's probably this Docker IO part here that indicates that it's a Docker image. But this would be a interview with Dan Walsh to know for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but
as I say, I don't remember. There's a few little tiny pieces of metadata that are different, like in weird ways.
Yeah, exactly. So that was my little demo. Like, kind of the point of the demo is that there's not much to it. But there's that that I wanted to share with y'all. And I noticed it is 56 after the hour, at least in Eastern. For Narendev, is that 36 probably? Or anybody else who's on a non-clean hour break. Let me share the
sweet internet point time, everybody. Scott, this is the
best part of the show.
Yeah.
So what do I do? Can I use these points? Can I make money off this?
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, we've seen people
just
trading
like
them on eBay.
You can make as much money on these as everyone else can. So, we've had a little bit of movement. We had a new person show up and see a couple of episodes over the break. I will say I have a few kind of administrative points that I give out. So like initial show and like some filing, some issues that are not represented here. So I just pulled it before that data was added. So these are a little shy. So maybe there will be some jitter come next episode. But Netherlands Hackham, who I actually haven't seen in the chat today.
No, he's here.
Is he? Okay.
Yeah.
But is leading. And then Narendev with relatively close second. And then Noah Friction slightly behind that. Have we seen Noah today? I'm not sure.
No. If they are watching, I haven't seen them comment.
And then Joe Fuzz, who holding on at 1,800 points, and then JP Dade. You gotta go fill out those forms. We know you're here a lot. But if you want to collect sweet internet points, which have the value of being listed on this list of people who have collected sweet internet points, you can go and at the bottom of the page there, you can just go to that form and enter that code. Or the other link there is basically a deep link to the same thing. And can you grab that, Chris, and put it in the chat? Or I can.
Can you?
Yes, if I can find the stupid window.
Right. Exactly.
So, and then one of the things that I've been trying to do recently, but don't always recall to do. Let me just throw this in the chat first. And so to someone's question in the chat, what are sweet internet points? They are unfortunately not like the $35,000 Bitcoin. They are a way that we like to encourage participation. So basically, there's a bunch of different things you can do to collect points. You can watch the episode and fill out the form like this. You can file a PR, which is actually how Netherlands Hackham has pulled ahead. And you can, there's a bunch of other activities. So if you go to the episode's repo, which I just realized I don't think we ever put a link to that in the chat. Let me just grab it. If you go to the episodes repo on the activities doc, there's a whole list of things that you can do to collect sweet internet points. And one of the things I was saying I've been doing lately is to try to collect some people who are new to the show and say, hey, I hope you came back, and we would love you to continue watching the show. Please, bring up your points, and thanks so much for coming to the show. So do we want to kind of wrap it up here? Do we have any other kind of points to make? Are there any other questions in the chat that we haven't answered? We are just about the top of the hour, but I don't think we have a hard stop today.
No, we don't. So we can.
Sadly, I do have another meeting.
Yeah. So like.
Yeah, but you don't want to go. You want to hang out here with us.
That's true.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, Scott. And let's see. I think we have some unrelated. HPE isn't.
No, I'm talking.
Yeah, okay.
JP Dade and I have been talking about HPE for a couple weeks now. So
gotcha.
Having to download patch files to his home and then upload them to work, and that is just an unfortunate use of time. I will call it.
Probably faster sometimes to FedEx a USB key.
Yeah, exactly.
So
never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon barreling down the highway with 1,000 tapes in the back.
Right. Well, that's one of the things. Like, I really like if I ran a data center, I just want to buy AWS, whatever it is, Glacier or whatever, where they roll up with the tractor trailer full of hard drives. Like,
so it's funny. Someone actually was complaining that AWS took an armed guard with the trailer, and like. That's how they protect your data. That's part of it.
Right. Yeah, it ain't money, it's data, which arguably sometimes is worth more. But yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. We, I think, are planning having an episode next week where we're going to talk about because we've been talking about Nextcloud as kind of like our de facto example, and we are going to take a look at applying service mesh features to Nextcloud,
which is like next level awesome.
Yeah, cloud native, kind of crazy. If you are unfamiliar with what a service mesh is, please come to the show. But it's, kind of in short, it provides a bunch of kind of administrative features that are hard to do cross-cutting into an application without massive application change, but with zero code. So it's pretty cool. So definitely come to the show next week. And Chris, what else do we have going on today or coming up this week?
Coming up here at 11 a.m. Eastern is the OpenShift Administrator Office Hour with Andrew Sullivan and I. I forget what he has planned today as his discussion point. I think he was still choosing between one or the other yesterday. But we'll be there to answer your questions, including, any problems with HPE equipment. So yeah, let us know at 11 a.m. Eastern. That is now 1600 UTC.
Sweet.
Awesome.
Like internet points. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right, see you guys.
Thank you for joining. Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate you joining.
Thank you
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott.
Cool. Take care.